The billionaire faced unexpected humiliation aboard a flight operated by her own airline. Her response transformed a dismissive pilot and a skeptical flight attendant into examples of change no one anticipated. Sophia Lane stepped into the bustling terminal, pulling a compact black suitcase behind her. Her casual jeans and a plain sweater helped her blend into the crowd, just the way she preferred it. Most people never connected her unassuming appearance to the high-profile headlines or the global airline she owned. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it with a practiced smile. "Enjoy your flight," the woman said cheerfully. Sophia gave a polite nod and headed down the jet bridge, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. As she entered the plane, she glanced at the crew welcoming passengers. 2 flight attendants stood at the door. One, a blonde woman with a tightly styled bun and striking red lipstick, barely glanced at her. "First class?" the blonde Alyssa Reed asked curtly, her tone far from welcoming. Sophia nodded. Alyssa arched an eyebrow, hesitated, and said, "May I see your boarding pass?" Sophia paused, her chest tightening. It wasn't a polite request, it was a challenge. Slowly, she retrieved the pass from her bag and handed it over. Alyssa examined it, lingering unnecessarily before handing it back. "Seat 2A, she said flatly, her tone clipped. Sophia nodded again and made her way to her seat, ignoring the faint, curious glances of the other passengers. She slipped her bag under the seat in front of her and sat down. The cool leather pressed against her back. She exhaled deeply, reaching for the complimentary water bottle on the tray. "Excuse me, ma'am," Alyssa's sharp voice interrupted. She was standing beside Sophia now, her tone louder and more pointed. "This is first class." Sophia looked up, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I know." Alyssa's eyes flicked to Sophia's bag and then back to her face. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Sophia felt the tension creep into her shoulders. "I showed you my boarding pass," she said, keeping her tone steady. Alyssa didn't move. "I'll double-check with the captain," she said, turning briskly. Sophia watched her stride away, her grip tightening on the water bottle. A moment later, a man in a crisp pilot's uniform appeared. His name tag read Ethan Barrett. His confident stride carried an edge of authority that felt almost aggressive. Ethan stopped in front of her seat, looking down at her like she was an issue to resolve. "Is there a problem?" he asked Alyssa. "She says this is her seat," Alyssa replied. Ethan turned to Sophia. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Without a word, Sophia handed it to him. He examined it, then looked at her. His mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something, but ultimately handed it back. "All right," he said, his voice devoid of apology. "Enjoy your flight." Sophia didn't respond. She watched him retreat to the cockpit, Alyssa trailing closely behind. The whispers of other passengers buzzed in her ears, her cheeks burning, but she kept her posture upright. As Alyssa began the safety demonstration, Sophia barely registered the instructions. Her chest felt tight. She closed her eyes, the memory of a childhood incident surfacing. A sunny day in the park. Her parents' laughter abruptly halted by a uniformed man telling them they didn't belong. She couldn't recall the exact words, but the sharp, dismissive tone was all too familiar. The plane taxied, and as it lifted off, Sophia opened her eyes, the force pressing her into the seat. She refused to glance at Alyssa, but could feel the woman's presence, hovering uncomfortably near. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Alyssa returned. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" she asked, her tone forced and flat. "No, thank you," Sophia replied evenly. Alyssa lingered for a moment, then walked away. Sophia took out her phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails. Her thoughts were too scattered to focus. Frustrated, she opened a blank note and began typing. "Ma'am," Alyssa's voice cut in again. This time, she carried a tray of snacks. She set it down on Sophia's tray table with an unnecessary force, causing one packet to tip over. "Careful," Sophia said calmly. Alyssa didn't respond. She turned and walked away, leaving Sophia to sit in the growing tension that seemed to stretch the hours. Sleep eluded her as she stared out the window at drifting clouds. When the plane finally landed, Sophia waited until most of the passengers had disembarked before standing. She retrieved her bag and moved toward the exit. Ethan and Alyssa stood by the door, thanking passengers as they left. "Have a good day," Ethan said without looking at her. Sophia stopped and turned to him. Her voice was steady but firm. "I'd like the name of your supervisor." Ethan frowned. Is there a problem? Yes, Sophia replied. Alyssa's face turned pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Sophia cut her off. I'll be filing a formal complaint. Without waiting for a response, Sophia stepped off the plane. Outside, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before someone answered. It's me, she said, her voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. We need to talk. Sophia Lane ended the call and took a deep, steadying breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was sharp and resolute. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The terminal was surprisingly quiet, but Sophia's thoughts were anything but calm. Her phone buzzed again with a new notification, but she ignored it, gripping the handle of her carry-on tighter. The walk to the car service felt like it stretched endlessly. Once inside the back seat of the sleek black sedan, she pulled the door shut with finality and exhaled sharply. Take me home, she told the driver, her voice firmer than she intended. The car pulled away, and almost immediately her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Parker Legal Team. Swiping to answer, she heard the familiar voice of her lead counsel, Julia Marks. Sophia, we got your message, Julia said without preamble. What happened? Sophia kept her tone steady but direct. Discrimination by a pilot and a flight attendant on my airline. There was silence on the other end before Julia finally responded. Are you certain it was intentional? Sophia scoffed, her jaw tightening. It wasn't subtle, Julia. She recounted the incident with precision, her words flowing as though she had rehearsed them. When she finished, Julia sighed. All right, we'll start with an internal review and loop in HR. No, Sophia interrupted, her voice firm. Not just HR. I want this escalated. A full investigation. Julia hesitated. That could bring negative press. Sophia's voice sharpened. Good. Let them see it. If this can happen to me, imagine what happens to passengers who don't have the power to fight back. Julia didn't argue. She promised to get the ball rolling and ended the call. Sophia stared out the car window as the city's skyline blurred past. The weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders. She reached for her phone again, her thumb hovering over a contact. After a moment of hesitation, she tapped it. Sophia, her brother Liam's voice answered casually, though a hint of concern lingered beneath the surface. What's going on? I had an incident today, Sophia began. Liam chuckled lightly. Another boardroom standoff? No, Sophia replied sharply. It was on a flight. The humor drained from Liam's tone. He listened in silence as Sophia detailed what had happened. When she finished, he let out a long sigh. Why do you always carry the weight of the world on your shoulders? He asked. Sophia clenched her jaw. This isn't about me, Liam. It's about fixing what's broken. Or, he countered, you could let someone else handle it. Focus on your work. I can't, she said quietly, her voice resolute. Liam sighed again, this time more resigned. Just don't let it consume you, okay? I'll be fine, Sophia replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The next morning, Sophia sat in her office, her gaze lingering on a framed photo of her and her late grandmother. Her grandmother's warm, unwavering smile reminded Sophia why she fought so hard, for people like her who had endured so much. Her assistant, Rachel, knocked softly and poked her head in. Miss Lane, someone from operations is here. You requested them? Sophia straightened. Send them in. The door opened wider to reveal a middle-aged man named David Kerr, the manager of crew relations for the airline. Miss Lane, David greeted her nervously. David, Sophia said, gesturing for him to sit. I assume you've heard about the incident on Flight 384 yesterday. He nodded, his expression grim. I've started reviewing the crew records. Both employees have been with us for some time. Any prior complaints? Sophia asked, leaning forward. None formally documented, David replied hesitantly. What about informal complaints? David shifted uncomfortably. There were some comments about the pilot. A few staff members mentioned he could be dismissive, but nothing that escalated. And the flight attendant? She's relatively new, David explained. Hired about a year ago. No recorded issues with passengers until now. Sophia processed the information, her expression unreadable. Ground them both. Effective immediately. No flights, no shifts, until further notice. David hesitated. That might cause tension with the union. Handle it, Sophia interrupted. This isn't negotiable. David nodded and stood to leave. I'll keep you updated. As he left, Sophia felt a flicker of satisfaction. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed with another call. Julia's voice greeted her on the other end. "We have a problem," Julia said without any preamble. "What kind of problem?" Sophia asked sharply. "The pilot, Ethan Barrett, is already trying to spin this," Julia explained. "He's claiming you were aggressive and disruptive during the flight." Sophia's grip tightened around her phone. "Are you serious?" "Completely. He's already spoken to a few colleagues. If this leaks, it could muddy the waters." Sophia exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. "Then we move fast. Escalate the investigation. This ends here." Sophia Lane sat in her apartment, trying to suppress the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Her conversation with Julia had been brief but revealing. If Captain Barrett thought he could rewrite the narrative, he was mistaken. "We need to move fast," Sophia had told Julia, her voice sharp. "Get statements from the passengers who witnessed what happened. Pull their contact information from the manifest." Julia hesitated. "That might come across as invasive." "I don't care how it looks," Sophia snapped. "We're not letting him manipulate the truth." Julia promised to handle it and hung up. By the evening, Sophia was back at her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. Her assistant had sent her a preliminary report on the company's policies and crew training. The gaps were glaring, almost appalling. Sophia rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of it all. The system wasn't just broken, it was decaying from the inside out. Her phone buzzed. This time, it was a text from Liam. "Hope you're not losing sleep over this." Sophia didn't reply. Instead, she opened her laptop and started drafting a plan. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her thoughts crystallizing into action. She listed immediate steps, suspensions, thorough investigations, a complete policy review. Then she shifted to long-term goals: mandatory diversity training, anonymous reporting systems, stricter oversight. Each word sharpened her resolve. The next morning, Sophia returned to her office. Her assistant, Rachel, handed her a stack of printed emails, statements from passengers who had been on the flight. Sophia skimmed through them, her stomach tightening. Most accounts aligned with her version of events, corroborating what she already knew. But one stood out. It was from a man seated in coach. He wrote that he had overheard Captain Barrett speaking with Alyssa before the confrontation. The pilot had allegedly said, "Why is she even here? She doesn't look like she belongs." Sophia set the paper down, her jaw tight. She stared out the window at the city skyline shimmering in the morning light. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. When Sophia entered the boardroom later that morning, her laptop tucked under her arm and a folder of printed statements in hand, the room grew quiet. Her legal team and senior executives were already seated. "Good morning," she said, taking her place at the head of the table. Her tone was composed, but the tension in her jaw revealed her mood. Julia sat to her right, a tablet open in front of her. "We've collected statements from multiple passengers," she began, sliding the tablet toward Sophia. "Most align with your account." Sophia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the highlighted sections. Each page confirmed what she already suspected. Blatant prejudice had occurred, and it wasn't an isolated incident. "Let's begin with immediate actions," Sophia said, her voice firm. "Have Ethan Barrett and Alyssa Reed been officially suspended?" David Kerr, who managed crew relations, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They've been removed from the schedule temporarily," he said, "but the union is already pushing back. They're claiming the suspensions are premature without a formal hearing." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Premature? We have witness statements and my first-hand account. How much more evidence do they need?" David cleared his throat. "It's complicated. The union is concerned this sets a precedent and could jeopardize their members' rights." Sophia's voice turned icy. "Protecting them from what? Accountability?" The room fell silent. David avoided her gaze, his pen fidgeting in his hand. Julia leaned in. "We need to approach this carefully, Sophia. If we push too hard, the union could retaliate, and this might escalate into a larger issue." Sophia exhaled slowly, her frustration palpable. "Fine. Here's the plan. Barrett and Reed remain grounded until further notice. We accelerate the investigation and finalize recommendations within the week. I won't let this drag on." The executives nodded, though their expressions were a mix of agreement and apprehension. After the meeting, Sophia stayed behind with Julia. "They don't get it," Sophia said, rubbing her temples. This isn't just about two employees. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester in this company. Julia nodded. I know, but changing a culture takes time and people hate change. Sophia's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen, a notification from a news site. Her story had leaked. The headline read, Airline CEO accuses own employees of discrimination. Sophia's stomach churned. She clicked the link and scanned the article. It quoted anonymous sources, likely employees, defending Barrett and Reed. Words like overreaction and misunderstanding stood out, glaring like neon signs. They're trying to discredit me, Sophia said, her voice tight. Julia leaned over to read the screen. It's not unexpected. When powerful people call out injustice, there's always pushback. Sophia locked her phone and stood. I'm not backing down. By midday, Sophia was on another call, this time with an external PR consultant. We need to get ahead of this, the consultant said. Your reputation is tied to the company, and right now, both are taking a hit. I don't care about my reputation, Sophia said bluntly. I care about fixing this mess. Well, the consultant replied carefully, fixing the mess starts with controlling the narrative. We need a statement, something that acknowledges the incident but also outlines the steps you're taking to address it. Sophia paused. Fine, draft something. Keep it direct, no fluff. The consultant promised to send a draft within the hour. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the city skyline. The road ahead was daunting, but she was ready. This wasn't about protecting an image. It was about building something better. The consultant leaned back in his chair, speaking with a measured tone. Fixing this starts with controlling the narrative. We need a statement from you, something that acknowledges the incident but outlines the steps you're taking to address it. Sophia Lane paused. Fine. Draft something. Keep it straightforward, no fluff. The consultant nodded. I'll have it to you within the hour. That evening, Sophia sat alone in her apartment, the draft PR statement glowing on her laptop screen. She stared at it, but her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Finally, she closed the laptop with a sigh and leaned back on her couch. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a video call from her brother. Hey, Sophia, Liam greeted her as the screen lit up with his face. You look exhausted. Because I am, she replied with a faint, forced smile. Any progress? Sophia sighed. Depends on how you define progress. Barrett and Reed are suspended, but the union is already making noise. And now the media's involved. Liam frowned. What's the endgame here, Sophia? You fix this one incident, then what? The world's still full of people like them. Sophia's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to fix the world, Liam. Just my corner of it. Liam tilted his head. And you think that'll be enough? It has to be, she said softly. He nodded, though his expression was skeptical. Just don't lose yourself in this fight. Remember who you are outside all this. I'll try, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The next morning, Sophia returned to the office. The building felt colder than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. Rachel handed her a coffee along with a printed report. HR sent this over, Rachel said. Sophia scanned the document, her stomach churning as the patterns became clear. Dismissive attitudes, condescending remarks, and microaggressions, all woven into the fabric of the crew's behavior. It wasn't surprising, but seeing it all laid out like this was sobering. She called David Kerr into her office. This isn't just about Barrett and Reed, she said, holding up the report. It's systemic. David nodded slowly. I know, but changing a system this big will take time and resources. We have both, Sophia replied firmly. What we don't have is an excuse to delay. David hesitated. What's your next move? Mandatory training for everyone, from the executive team to the cleaning staff. David's eyebrows shot up. That's ambitious. It's necessary, Sophia replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. Start putting together a plan. By lunchtime, Sophia was in a meeting with her executive team. She stood at the head of the room, her gaze unwavering. We're rolling out mandatory training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, she announced. This isn't optional. It starts next month. One executive raised a hand. Sophia, with all due respect, this is going to cost millions. We're already dealing with financial pressure from the fallout of this incident. Sophia met his gaze without flinching. What's more expensive, fixing the problem or ignoring it until it explodes again? The room fell silent. I'm not asking for permission, she continued. This is happening. Make it work. The tension lingered even after the meeting ended. Back in her office, Sophia felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her. Rachel knocked softly. "Miss Lane, there's someone in the lobby asking to see you. They say they were on your flight." Sophia frowned. "Did they give a name?" "No, but they seemed insistent." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Send them up." A few minutes later, a woman in her late 30s stepped into Sophia's office, clutching a small bag against her chest. She looked nervous. "Thank you for seeing me," the woman said. "I'm sorry to just show up like this." "It's all right," Sophia said, gesturing for her to sit. "How can I help you?" The woman sat, her hands trembling slightly. "I was on flight 384. I saw what happened." Sophia's chest tightened. "I wanted to say thank you," the woman continued, "for standing up for yourself, for all of us." Sophia blinked, caught off guard. "I've flown a lot," the woman said, her voice growing steadier. "I've seen things, small things, but they add up. Most people let it slide. You didn't, and that gives me hope." Sophia felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. The woman smiled. "I just wanted you to know. It matters." After the woman left, Sophia sat back in her chair, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. Early the next morning, Sophia was at her desk, the glow of her laptop illuminating the room. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside her, forgotten. Her fingers moved furiously over the keyboard as she typed emails to department heads, legal teams, and her PR consultant. This wasn't about Flight 384 anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had failed for far too long. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. Julia was on the other end. "I've got the union reps on hold," Julia said without preamble. "They want a meeting about Barrett and Reed. They're calling the suspensions a violation of protocol." Sophia rubbed her temples. "Fine. Schedule it for tomorrow. I'll be there." Julia hesitated. "They're gonna push back hard." Sophia's voice was steady, unyielding. "Then they're in for a fight," Valerie warned. "They're already framing this as a misunderstanding." "Then they're in for a reality check," Sophia Lane replied, her voice steady. "Anything else?" "One more thing," Valerie said. "The media is doubling down. Barrett's been feeding them his side of the story, painting himself as the victim." Sophia's stomach churned, but she forced her tone to remain calm. "Let him talk. The truth will drown him out." Later that morning, Sophia arrived at the company's downtown headquarters. The building's sleek glass facade reflected the bustling street below, a stark reminder that the world was watching her every move. She entered the lobby, nodded at the receptionist, and headed straight for the elevator. Inside the boardroom, her top executives were already waiting. David Kerr was present, along with representatives from PR, HR, and legal. Sophia placed her laptop on the table and opened it. "Let's get started," she said, cutting through the polite small talk. "David, what's the status of Barrett and Reed?" "They're officially grounded," David replied. "But Barrett's already filed a formal request for a review. The union is backing him, claiming his suspension violates due process." "Of course they are," Sophia muttered. "And Reed?" "Less noise from her camp," David said. "She's still employed and technically eligible to return to flights once the investigation is over." "Not happening," Sophia said firmly. "Neither of them sets foot on one of our planes until this is resolved." The team dove into a lengthy discussion about policy gaps, flagged incidents from passengers, and the potential fallout in the media. Each revelation made the scope of the problem clearer and heavier. "We've also identified a pattern," someone from HR added. "Reports of microaggressions from several crew members, including Barrett. Comments about passengers' appearances, assumptions about their financial status. It's all documented." Sophia felt her jaw tighten. And no one thought to act on this before? HR exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. "We can't fix what's broken if no one acknowledges it," Sophia said sharply. "Starting today, every single incident gets logged, reviewed, and escalated if necessary. No exceptions." By the time the meeting ended, Sophia's head was pounding. She retreated to her office, closing the door behind her to catch her breath. But there was no time to rest. Her phone buzzed. It was Liam. "Hey sis," he said when she answered. "How's the revolution going?" Sophia sighed. "People are resisting every step of the way." "Of course they are," Liam said. "Change scares people." "I'm not scared of their fear," Sophia replied. I'm just tired of fighting everyone. It's like no one wants to admit there's a problem, because admitting it means they'd have to do something about it. Liam was quiet for a moment. Most people would rather stay comfortable. Well, I'm not here to make anyone comfortable, Sophia said firmly. Liam chuckled softly. That's the Sophia I know. Just don't forget to take care of yourself in the process, okay? I'll try, she said, though she doubted she'd have the time. The next day, Sophia faced the union representatives in a meeting room that felt more like a battlefield. They sat across from her, their expressions guarded but resolute. Valerie and David flanked her, their silent support palpable. Let's get straight to the point, one of the reps began. We believe the suspensions of Captain Barrett and Flight Attendant Reed were premature and unjustified. There was no formal hearing, no chance for them to defend themselves. Sophia leaned forward, her gaze piercing. They'll have their hearing, but their actions on that flight were unacceptable. I won't allow them to continue working while we investigate. This sets a dangerous precedent, the rep countered. You're opening the door for anyone to be suspended over unproven allegations. These aren't just allegations, Sophia shot back. We have witness statements corroborating their behavior. And let's not forget, I was there. I lived it. The room went silent, her words heavy in the air. The rep shifted uncomfortably. Even so, he said finally, we have protocols for a reason. They deserve a fair process. They'll get their process, Sophia replied. But fairness doesn't mean turning a blind eye to their actions. The meeting ended in a stalemate, but Sophia left with her resolve intact. The union's resistance only strengthened her determination. That evening, Sophia attended a diversity and inclusion workshop at the request of one of her HR executives. The room was filled with employees from various levels of the company, all gathered to learn and discuss ways to create a more inclusive workplace. As Sophia listened to the facilitator, she felt a glimmer of hope. The discussions were raw and uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Employees shared stories of feeling overlooked or marginalized, while others listened with genuine interest. Near the end of the session, a young flight attendant raised her hand. I just wanted to say thank you, Miss Lane, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What you're doing isn't easy, but it's important. Sophia felt her chest tighten. She nodded, her voice soft but firm. Thank you. That means a lot. I think a lot of us feel safer knowing you're fighting for us, the young flight attendant said, her voice trembling slightly. Sophia Lane nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot, she replied. Later that night, Sophia sat at her desk, reviewing her notes from the workshop. Her phone buzzed with a message from Julia Marks. Passenger testimonials are coming in. Most are on your side. We're building momentum. Sophia allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. She leaned back in her chair and gazed out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, a reminder of the countless lives her decisions could impact. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Sophia arrived at the company's training facility. The building, with its modern glass walls, was flooded with sunlight that illuminated the spacious lobby. She wasn't there to sit quietly on the sidelines. She intended to make her presence known. This training wasn't a box to check. It was the first step in transforming the culture of her company. As she walked into the main conference room, the buzz of conversation quieted. Employees from various departments were seated at round tables, their name tags displayed prominently. Among them were Ethan Barrett and Alyssa Reed, sitting at separate tables. Their expressions alternated between irritation and unease. Sophia stepped to the front of the room, allowing the silence to settle before she began. Good morning, she said, her voice steady but commanding. I know some of you might feel uncomfortable being here. That's fine. Growth is uncomfortable. But let me be clear, this training isn't optional. It's essential. For far too long, we've allowed toxic behaviors to go unchecked. That ends now. She scanned the room, her eyes briefly locking with Ethan's. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. This isn't just about one incident, she continued. It's about building a company where everyone, employees and passengers alike, feels respected. Today is about starting that process. With that, she stepped aside and allowed the facilitator to take over. The first exercise began with role-playing scenarios. Employees were paired up and given situations designed to highlight unconscious biases. Sophia observed as people hesitated, some stumbling through the exercises, while others engaged with genuine effort. Alyssa was paired with a younger flight attendant, tasked with a scenario involving a passenger questioning the competence of a female pilot. Alyssa's responses were curt, her tone defensive. The facilitator stepped in gently. "Why do you think you responded that way?" Alyssa muttered, "I don't see why this is necessary. I just do my job." "Doing your job includes respecting everyone," the facilitator replied calmly. "That's what we're trying to address here." Across the room, Ethan sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His partner, a maintenance technician, looked visibly uncomfortable. When it was Ethan's turn to respond to a scenario, he leaned back in his chair and said flatly, "I'd handle it the same way I always do, professionally." The facilitator pressed him. "Can you give an example of how you'd ensure the passenger feels respected in this situation?" Ethan shrugged. "Respect is earned. I treat people based on how they treat me." Sophia felt her chest tighten. The tension in the room shifted, Ethan's words hanging in the air like a cold gust. During a break, Sophia stepped outside for some air. She leaned against the railing, letting the crisp morning breeze cool her thoughts. Footsteps behind her broke the quiet. She turned to see Alyssa approaching hesitantly. "Ms. Lane," Alyssa began, fidgeting with the hem of her uniform shirt. "Can I speak with you?" "Go ahead," Sophia said, her tone neutral. I didn't mean for things to go this far on the flight," Alyssa stammered. I just thought you didn't belong there." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "And what does someone who belongs in first class look like, Alyssa?" Alyssa's face flushed. "I don't know. Expensive clothes, maybe? It wasn't personal. I swear it wasn't personal." Sophia's voice turned cold. "You humiliated me in front of an entire cabin. If that's not personal, I don't know what is." Alyssa's shoulders slumped, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Sophia cut in. "You didn't think. You let your assumptions dictate your actions. And it wasn't just me. How many other passengers have you treated like that without realizing it?" Alyssa didn't respond. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Sophia sighed, her voice softening slightly. "I appreciate the apology, but words aren't enough. You need to do better. This training is your chance to start." Alyssa nodded and walked away, leaving Sophia to stare out at the city skyline. The apology felt hollow, but it was something, a small crack in the armor. The afternoon session focused on group discussions. Employees were encouraged to share experiences where they felt either empowered or marginalized. Some stories were deeply personal, drawing murmurs of empathy from the room. Others revealed uncomfortable truths about the workplace. As the conversations unfolded, Sophia felt the tension in her shoulders ease, replaced by a glimmer of cautious hope. Change was slow, but this was a beginning. When it was Ethan Barrett's turn to speak, he remained silent for a moment, his arms crossed defensively. Finally, he said, "I don't really have a story to share. I've always just done my job and expected the same from others." The room was quiet. The facilitator chose not to push him and moved on to the next participant. Later, during a small group discussion, Sophia Lane noticed Ethan speaking more freely. He recounted a story about a passenger who had berated him during a flight. "They kept calling me incompetent, demanding to see my credentials," Ethan said. "It was humiliating." "And how did you handle it?" one of the group members asked. "I stayed professional," Ethan replied. "What else could I do?" Sophia observed him closely. For the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in his voice. By the end of the day, the energy in the room had shifted. The initial resistance had softened, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. Sophia stood at the front of the room again to address the group. "Today was just the beginning," she said. "This isn't a one-time thing. It's a commitment we're making, to each other and to our passengers. I know it won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." She paused, letting her words settle. "I'm asking all of you to hold yourselves accountable, and I'll be doing the same. Together, we can make this company better, but it starts with each of us." As the employees filed out, some approached her to shake her hand or offer a quiet thank you. Alyssa Reed was among them, her expression tentative but sincere. Ethan left without a word, his gaze fixed straight ahead. That evening, Sophia returned to her apartment and collapsed onto the couch. Her body ached from the long day, but her mind was sharper than ever. She picked up her phone and called Julia Marks. "How did it go?" Julia asked. "It's a start," Sophia replied. "But Ethan is still a problem. He's resistant, and I'm not sure if he'll ever change." "Some people won't," Julia said. "But this isn't just about him, it's about setting a standard." Sophia nodded, even though Julia couldn't see her. "You're right. We'll keep pushing." After hanging up, Sophia sat in silence, her thoughts racing. Today had been a small victory, but the road ahead was long. This wasn't just about her. She was fighting for every employee, every passenger, and every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Sophia arrived at her office early. Her desk was already covered in reports and emails from her team. She picked up the latest update on the investigation into Ethan Barrett and Alyssa Reed. The dense text felt heavy in her hands, detailing patterns of subtle discrimination within the flight crews. This wasn't just about two individuals, it was systemic, rooted in attitudes that had gone unchecked for too long. Her assistant, Rachel, knocked gently on the door, breaking her focus. "Miss Lane, HR is ready for you." Sophia stood, smoothing her blazer. Today's meeting wasn't just about policy. It was about accountability. She walked to the conference room, where members of the HR department and legal team waited. David Kerr was there too, flipping through a folder of documents. "We've gathered additional testimony from employees," David began, as Sophia took her seat. "Some are supportive of Barrett and Reed, claiming they've always been professional, but others—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Others confirm patterns of microaggressions and dismissive behavior, particularly from Barrett." Sophia leaned forward. "And what about Reed? Has she shown any signs of remorse since the training?" David hesitated. "She's been more cooperative. Her tone has changed, and she started asking questions during the sessions. It's progress." Sophia nodded slowly. "And Barrett?" David's lips thinned. "Still resistant. He participates, but it's clear he's not engaging. He doesn't see the value in it." Sophia tapped her pen against the table. "Then he's going to see it firsthand." By midday, Sophia had arranged a meeting with Ethan. She wanted to speak with him directly, no intermediaries. When he arrived at her office, his posture was rigid, and his uniform was immaculate. His face betrayed no emotion, but Sophia could sense the tension in his movements. "Captain Barrett," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." He nodded curtly, lowering himself into the chair across from her desk. "You asked to see me?" "Yes," Sophia replied, keeping her tone even. "I wanted to discuss the ongoing training and your participation in it." His jaw tightened. "I've been attending every session as required." "I'm aware," Sophia said, "but attendance isn't enough. The goal isn't just to show up, it's to engage, to reflect, and to grow." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, Miss Lane, I've been a pilot for over 20 years. I've handled thousands of flights, dealt with difficult passengers, and trained new crew members. I know how to do my job." "No one's questioning your technical skills," Sophia replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't about flying planes, it's about how you treat people. And from what I've seen, there's room for improvement." "Your technical skills aren't in question, Captain Barrett," Sophia said. "But this isn't about flying planes, it's about how you treat people. And from what I've seen, there's room for improvement." Ethan's expression darkened. "I've never had a passenger complain about me before this." "That doesn't mean there haven't been issues," Sophia countered. "It just means no one felt empowered to speak up until now." The room fell silent. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. For a moment, Sophia thought he might walk out, but instead, he surprised her. "I don't see what I did wrong," he said quietly. "I followed procedure. I asked for your boarding pass, just like I would with anyone else." Sophia leaned forward. "And how often do you ask first-class passengers to prove they belong there?" Ethan didn't answer. "That's what this is about," Sophia continued. "It's not just what you did, it's why you did it. And until you're willing to confront that, nothing will change." Ethan sat in silence, his shoulders stiff. Sophia decided to end the conversation there. She didn't expect a breakthrough today, but planting the seed was enough. Meanwhile, Alyssa Reed was experiencing her own transformation. The training sessions had started to chip away at her defensiveness, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about her behavior. During one session, the facilitator asked participants to share a time they felt judged unfairly. Alyssa hesitated, then raised her hand. "When I first started as a flight attendant," she said, her voice shaky, "I felt like I didn't belong. I was new, younger than most of the crew, and they treated me like I was incompetent. I had to work twice as hard to prove myself." The room was silent as she continued. "Somewhere along the way, I guess I forgot what that felt like, and I started doing the same thing to others." The facilitator nodded. "Awareness is the first step. The question is, what will you do with it?" Alyssa didn't have an answer, but for the first time she felt like she wanted to find one. By the end of the week, Sophia received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Request for additional training." It was from Ethan. Sophia opened it, her heart racing slightly. The email was short but sincere. Ethan admitted that he hadn't fully understood the value of the training initially, but wanted to learn more. He asked for resources and offered to meet with the facilitator for a one-on-one session. Sophia leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't a complete turnaround, but it was progress. The following Monday, Sophia joined another training session. This time, she sat among the employees, participating in the exercises and discussions. The atmosphere was noticeably different, more open, less resistant. People were starting to connect, sharing their stories and listening to others. At one point, a young ground crew member stood up and addressed the room. "I used to think this kind of training was pointless," he admitted. "But hearing everyone's experiences has changed my perspective. I didn't realize how much harm small actions could cause." The room erupted into applause, and Sophia felt a flicker of hope. Change was slow, but it was happening. As the session ended, Sophia caught up with Alyssa in the hallway. "How are you feeling?" Sophia asked. Alyssa smiled nervously. "Better. Still a lot to learn, but better." Sophia nodded. "That's all I can ask for. Keep pushing yourself. It's worth it." Alyssa hesitated, then said, "Thank you for giving me a chance to fix this." Sophia watched her walk away, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. People could change if they were willing to do the work, and Alyssa was proving that. That evening, Sophia sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. Her phone buzzed with a message from Julia. "Momentum is building. Let's keep pushing." Sophia stared at the screen, then typed a simple reply, "We will." This fight wasn't just about Flight 384 anymore. It was about creating a future where respect and dignity weren't optional, and Sophia was ready to lead the charge. Sophia sat in the back of a sleek black SUV, her phone balanced on her knee. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others angry. The story of Flight 384 had gained national attention, and opinions were pouring in from every direction. News outlets were dissecting her leadership, the training initiatives, and the broader implications for corporate accountability. Her assistant glanced back at her from the front seat. "We're almost at the studio, Miss Lane. They'll be ready for you in 10 minutes. Sophia nodded, her stomach tightening. She didn't mind public speaking, but interviews like this were different. Every word would be scrutinized, every expression analyzed. She glanced at her reflection in the window, straightened her blazer, and took a deep breath. Inside the studio, the lights were blinding. A producer guided her to a sleek chair in front of a backdrop featuring the city skyline. The interviewer, a polished man in his 40s, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Miss Lane, thank you for joining us." "Thank you for having me," Sophia replied, her voice steady but measured. "Thank you for joining us," the interviewer said as they took their seats. "Thank you for having me," Sophia Lane replied, her voice calm but firm. The cameras rolled, and the interview began. The first few questions were routine, about her background, her journey to becoming CEO, and the company's history. Then came the pivot. "Let's talk about Flight 384, the interviewer said, leaning forward slightly. "It's been reported that you experienced discrimination from your own employees. Can you walk us through what happened?" Sophia's expression remained steady. She recounted the incident concisely, avoiding embellishments. She highlighted how the experience brought to light deeper systemic issues within the company and why she felt compelled to take immediate action. "Some have called your response drastic," the interviewer pressed. Mandatory training, suspensions, a complete overhaul of policies. Do you think it's too much? Sophia met his gaze evenly. When lives are at stake, whether it's the safety of a passenger or their dignity, there's no such thing as too much. This isn't about one flight or one incident. It's about setting a standard for how people deserve to be treated. The interviewer nodded, clearly impressed. And how has the public response influenced your decision-making? Sophia took a moment to reflect. Public opinion matters, she said, but it's not what drives me. My decisions are based on what's right, not what's popular. If that means facing criticism, so be it. The rest of the interview delved into the company's plans for reform, the challenges of leadership, and Sophia's vision for the future. By the time it ended, she felt both drained and resolute. Back at the office, Julia Marks was waiting with updates. The interview's already trending, Julia said, handing Sophia her phone. Sophia scrolled through the headlines. Words like bold, trailblazing, and controversial jumped out at her. But so did phrases like overreach and unnecessary theatrics. Not everyone's going to get it, Julia said, as if reading her thoughts. But you're making waves. That's what matters. Sophia set the phone down. What's the status on Barrett and Reed? Barrett completed his one-on-one session with the facilitator this morning, Julia replied. The feedback is mixed. He's engaging more, but there's still resistance. Reed, on the other hand, is making steady progress. She's even started mentoring newer flight attendants about handling difficult situations. Sophia nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. Good, keep me updated. As the days passed, the ripple effects of Sophia's reforms began to spread through the company. Crew members shared stories of transformation on internal forums and social media. Some posts were raw, admitting past biases and pledging to do better. Others celebrated the newfound sense of inclusion among staff. One post caught Sophia's attention. It was from a senior flight attendant who had worked for the airline for over 15 years. I used to think these trainings were a waste of time, the post read, but hearing my colleagues' stories made me realize how much I'd overlooked. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge. I'm grateful to work for a company that's willing to have these conversations. Sophia read the post twice, feeling a rare moment of pride. Change wasn't easy, but it was happening. The momentum wasn't without its challenges. The union continued to push back, arguing that the reforms placed undue pressure on employees. Meanwhile, Ethan Barrett's resistance became a focal point for critics in the media, who painted him as a scapegoat for larger systemic issues. Sophia addressed these criticisms head-on, releasing a statement that emphasized the reforms were about accountability, not punishment. She reiterated the company's commitment to fostering a culture of respect. The backlash didn't disappear, but it began to quiet. Support from passengers and employees started to outweigh the negativity, and the narrative began to shift. One afternoon, Sophia's assistant, Rachel, buzzed her office. Miss Lane, there's a passenger from Flight 384 here to see you. He says he has something important to share. Sophia frowned. Send him in. A middle-aged man entered, his posture nervous but determined. Miss Lane, he said, introducing himself as Daniel. I was one of the passengers seated near you on that flight. Sophia gestured for him to sit. How can I help you? I just wanted to thank you, Daniel said, his voice steady. What you're doing, it's important. I've flown with this airline for years and seen things that didn't sit right. But I never said anything. I didn't think it would make a difference. Sophia leaned forward. It does make a difference, Daniel. Every voice matters. He nodded. That's why I'm here. I wanted to share something I overheard on that flight. Before the incident, I heard Barrett say something about how you didn't look like you belonged in first class. Sophia's stomach tightened. She took a deep breath. Thank you for telling me. Would you be willing to provide a written statement? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. If it helps, I'll do it. As he left, Sophia sat back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Daniel's words confirmed what she had suspected and deepened her resolve. Sophia gestured for Daniel to sit. It's never easy to speak up, but it does make a difference. Every voice matters, she said. Daniel nodded. That's why I'm here. I wanted to share something I overheard on that flight. Before the incident with you, I heard the crew talking. The pilot, Barrett, made a comment about how you didn't look like a first-class passenger. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after everything that happened. Sophia's stomach tightened. Thank you for telling me, she said. Would you be willing to provide a written statement? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. If it helps, I'll do it. As Daniel left, Sophia sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Barrett's comment wasn't surprising, but hearing it confirmed by another passenger reignited her resolve. That evening, Sophia met with Julia Marks to discuss the latest developments. We need to escalate the investigation into Barrett, Sophia said. Daniel's testimony adds another layer to this. Julia nodded. Agreed. I'll make sure it's included in the final report. And Reed? Sophia asked. She's progressing well. I think she might be ready to return to flight soon, Julia said. Sophia considered. Let's make it a conditional return. She needs to complete an additional mentorship program first. Done, Julia said, making a note. As the meeting ended, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the fight wasn't over. The following week, Sophia boarded another flight with the airline. This time, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The crew greeted her warmly, their professionalism genuine. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but smile. The journey wasn't complete, but they were heading in the right direction. Sophia sat at the head of the conference table in the executive boardroom, surrounded by her senior leadership team. The air was tense, but her expression remained steady. In front of her were two folders, one containing the final report on Barrett and Reed, the other a proposal for the next phase of reforms. Let's start with the investigation results, she said, nodding at Julia. Julia adjusted her glasses and opened the first folder. The findings confirm patterns of discriminatory behavior from Captain Barrett. Both passenger accounts and his interactions with crew members highlight this. Several employees described him as dismissive and resistant to feedback, particularly from women and people of color. Sophia's jaw tightened. She gestured for Julia to continue. As for Reed, her case is different. While she displayed bias during the incident on Flight 384, there's evidence of genuine effort to improve. Since the training sessions began, she's been proactive in seeking mentorship opportunities and has even volunteered to lead future diversity workshops. Sophia tapped her pen against the table, processing the information. Recommendations? Julia cleared her throat. For Barrett, termination. For Reed, a conditional return to duty with ongoing mentorship and monitoring. The room fell silent, all eyes on Sophia. She nodded slowly. Approved. Make it happen. David Kerr, who had been scribbling notes, looked up. There's one more thing, Miss Lane. Barrett has requested a meeting with you before the decision is finalized. Sophia's eyebrows lifted slightly. Did he say why? No, but he seemed reflective, David replied. He specifically asked to speak with you alone. Sophia leaned back in her chair, considering. Set it up. Let's see what he has to say. 2 days later, Ethan Barrett arrived at Sophia's office. He looked different, his usual confidence subdued, his expression guarded but not defiant. Sophia gestured for him to sit, her demeanor calm but firm. Captain Barrett, she began, folding her hands on her desk. You asked to meet. I'm listening. He exhaled deeply, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Ms. Lane, I wanted to explain, not excuse, just explain. Sophia's gaze didn't waver. Go on. Barrett hesitated, then began. I've been flying for over 2 decades. In that time, I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some frustrating. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing passengers as problems to manage rather than people to serve. That's not an explanation, Sophia said, her tone measured. That's an excuse for bad behavior. Barrett nodded, swallowing hard. You're right, it is. And I realize now that I've let my biases influence how I treat people, even if I didn't recognize it at the time. Sophia leaned forward slightly. Why now, Captain Barrett? Why reflect on this after so much resistance? He looked down at his hands, then back at her. Because I've seen the impact of your leadership. The training sessions, the conversations they've sparked, it's forced me to confront things I didn't want to see about myself. I know I've made mistakes and I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know, I'm trying to change. Sophia studied him, searching for sincerity. Change takes more than words, Captain. It takes action. And trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I understand, he said, his voice steady. I wanted you to know where I stand before any decisions are made. Ethan Barrett said, his voice quieter now. Sophia Lane nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you for coming to me directly, Captain Barrett, but the decision about your position isn't just about this conversation, it's about the bigger picture." Ethan stood, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As he left, Sophia stared at the door for a long moment, her thoughts racing. Ethan's words had been unexpected, but they didn't change the facts. That afternoon, Sophia met with her leadership team to finalize the next phase of reforms. The agenda was ambitious, expanding training programs, implementing an anonymous reporting system, and forming a diversity council within the company. "We need to make sure these changes aren't just performative," Sophia said, addressing the room. "They have to be woven into the fabric of our culture. That means ongoing accountability from the top down." One executive raised a hand. "What about the financial impact? These initiatives aren't cheap, and we're already facing scrutiny from investors." Sophia's gaze sharpened. "What's the cost of not doing it? Losing passenger trust? Lawsuits? Employee turnover? The long-term risks far outweigh the short-term costs." The room fell silent. No one dared to argue further. Over the next few weeks, the reforms began rolling out. Mandatory training sessions were expanded to include all employees, from the executive suite to ground staff. The anonymous reporting system launched with a promise that every submission would lead to action. The Diversity Council was formed, comprising representatives from various departments and backgrounds. Sophia remained heavily involved, attending council meetings, reviewing reports, and participating in follow-up sessions with employees. She wasn't just leading from the top, she was in the trenches, showing her commitment to the cause. One day during a Diversity Council meeting, Sophia received a handwritten note from Alyssa Reed. The note read, "Miss Lane, I wanted to thank you for giving me a second chance. The training sessions have opened my eyes to things I didn't realize I was doing, and I'm committed to doing better. I hope to make you proud." Sophia folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. It was a small gesture, but it reinforced why she was doing this work. As the company began to stabilize, Sophia took a moment to reflect. She thought about the passengers who had spoken out, the employees who had embraced the changes, and the critics who had tried to derail her efforts. Every step had been a battle, but the results were undeniable. The company was evolving, slowly but surely. One evening, as Sophia prepared to leave the office, David Kerr stopped by her door. "Miss Lane, I thought you should know, Barrett submitted his resignation today." Sophia froze, then nodded. "Did he say why?" "He just said he felt it was the right thing to do. He thanked us for the opportunity to reflect and grow." Sophia sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't the outcome she had expected, but it felt right. Barrett had made his choice, and she respected it. Later that night, Sophia boarded a flight with her airline. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached her, a young woman with a warm smile and a confident demeanor. "Miss Lane," the woman said, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for this company. It means a lot to all of us." Sophia smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the plane taxied down the runway, Sophia gazed out the window. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace. The changes she had fought for were taking root, and the company was on its way to becoming something she could truly be proud of. Sophia stood in the corner of the boardroom, watching as the new Diversity Council conducted their first independent meeting. The energy in the room was palpable, voices overlapping as employees discussed ideas for further improvements. The group included people from every department: pilots, ground crew, customer service reps, and corporate executives. For the first time, Sophia wasn't leading the charge. She had laid the foundation, but now it was their turn to carry it forward. "Ms. Lane," one of the council members called out, pulling her from her thoughts. "Would you like to add anything before we move on?" Sophia smiled and shook her head. "This is your space. I'm just here to support." She stayed a while longer, listening as they debated new strategies for fostering inclusion across the company. When the meeting ended, Sophia lingered to thank the council members individually. As she left the room, she felt a sense of pride and relief. Change was happening, and for the first time, she could see the team carrying the vision forward. As the last few council members left the room, Alyssa Reed approached Sophia Lane. "Miss Lane, do you have a minute?" Alyssa asked. "Of course," Sophia replied. Alyssa hesitated, then handed her a small envelope. "This is for you. I wanted to express how much this process has changed me and how grateful I am for the second chance." Sophia opened the envelope later that evening in her office. Inside was a handwritten letter. Alyssa described how the training sessions had opened her eyes to her own biases and how she had begun mentoring other flight attendants. "You didn't have to give me another opportunity, but you did. I won't waste it. Thank you for believing I could be better." Sophia set the letter down, her throat tightening. She had faced plenty of resistance during this journey, but moments like these made it worth it. A week later, Sophia was invited to speak at a national aviation conference. The event was attended by executives, pilots, and industry leaders from around the world. Her reforms had garnered attention far beyond her airline, and people were eager to hear from the woman who had challenged the status quo. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Sophia adjusted the microphone and took a moment to scan the room. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "When I started this journey, I didn't set out to make headlines or spark debates. I simply wanted to address an incident of injustice. But what I quickly realized was that the problem wasn't isolated, it was systemic, and systemic problems require systemic solutions." She spoke about the challenges of implementing change, the resistance she faced, and the lessons she learned along the way. Change is messy. It's uncomfortable, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's necessary. Because if we want our industry to thrive, we have to ensure that every person, whether they're sitting in the cockpit, the cabin, or the passenger seat, feels respected and valued. The room fell silent as her words sank in. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished at my company," she continued. "But I know the work is far from over. My hope is that our journey inspires others to take a hard look at their own organizations, because we all have a responsibility to do better." The audience gave her a standing ovation as she stepped off the stage. Several industry leaders approached her afterward, asking for advice on implementing similar reforms in their own companies. Back at the office, Sophia continued to oversee the next phase of changes. The airline's anonymous reporting system had already uncovered several issues, and the Diversity Council was working to address them. One afternoon, her assistant Rachel entered her office. "Miss Lane, there's a letter here for you. It's from a passenger." "Bring it in," Sophia said. The letter was from a woman named Teresa, who had flown with the airline a month after the incident on Flight 384. Teresa described how a flight attendant had gone out of their way to make her feel welcome, even noticing that she seemed nervous and offering extra support. "I've flown with many airlines, but this was the first time I felt truly seen and cared for. I later learned about the changes you've made, and I just wanted to say thank you. It's making a difference." Sophia leaned back in her chair, the weight of the letter settling over her. Every small victory felt like proof that the work mattered. As the months passed, the company's culture began to shift. Employee engagement scores rose, and passengers shared stories of improved experiences. Even the media began to change its tone, praising the airline for its leadership in addressing systemic issues. One evening, as Sophia prepared to leave the office, David Kerr stopped by her door with a stack of reports. "Thought you might want to see these," he said, handing them over. Sophia flipped through the pages. They were filled with data showing the positive impact of the reforms: higher employee satisfaction, fewer complaints, and increased passenger loyalty. "This is just the beginning," David said with a smile. Sophia nodded. "It always is." A few weeks later, Sophia boarded another flight, this time as a passenger. She kept her presence low-key, sitting quietly in her first-class seat. The crew didn't recognize her, but their professionalism and warmth were evident in every interaction. As the plane soared above the clouds, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The fight for change had been grueling, but it had also been transformative, not just for the company, but for her as a leader. When the flight attendant offered her a drink, Sophia smiled and declined. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying more weight than the crew could know. The flight landed smoothly, and Sophia stepped off the plane with a sense of quiet pride. The road ahead was still long, but she knew they were heading in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about what lay beyond the horizon.